It was just another morning at the corporate headquarters. The conference room was filled with the usual crowd, executives in crisp suits, their faces a mix of indifference and mild intrigue as the new developer prepared to pitch his latest project. Brian Hayes, the CEO, leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled in a posture of quiet arrogance. He'd heard pitches like this 100 times before. They all sounded the same, too much hype, too little substance. And most of them, he knew, would fall through the cracks just like the others. "Let's hear what you've got, Mr. Turner," Brian said, barely masking his disdain. He had no idea who this developer was, or how big the deal he was about to dismiss really was. James Turner, the developer, stepped forward. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere in the room. He didn't seem nervous, but there was a certain intensity in his eyes, as if he knew something that the others didn't. He clicked his laptop open, and the room fell silent as the screen flashed to life. On it was a series of projections, charts, and an unfamiliar company logo, a company Brian hadn't heard of but felt sure was just another startup that would burn out in a year. "This," James began, his voice steady, "is the blueprint for a revolutionary power move in the tech and energy sectors. A move that's set to disrupt everything." Brian raised an eyebrow, the flicker of amusement in his eyes. A revolutionary move? Here it came again, the same buzzwords that got thrown around in boardrooms every day. But this time, something was different. He didn't know it yet, but the man standing before him wasn't just another tech dreamer. "Go on," Brian said dismissively, waving a hand. "I'm listening, though I'm not sure you're giving me anything that'll change my mind." James gave a slight nod, unfazed by the tone, and continued, "I've secured backing from one of the most influential players in the market. This isn't just a pitch, it's a done deal." Brian couldn't help himself. A slight chuckle escaped his lips. "You've secured what, exactly?" James didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, opening a folder on the table and revealing a single document, an agreement worth $2.5 billion. Brian's smirk faded just a little, but it was enough to catch the attention of those around him. "A deal worth that much?" He scoffed. "What, you expect me to believe you've really got someone to back you for that kind of money?" The rest of the room exchanged glances, some curious, others already writing off James as just another dreamer who didn't know the first thing about real business. James nodded calmly, not at all rattled by Brian's mockery. "This isn't just a pitch, Brian. This is the future. And you're about to miss it." He left it hanging there, a tension that would eventually crack, but Brian wasn't ready to see it. Not yet. Brian leaned back in his chair again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at the document James had just shown him. There it was in black and white, a commitment from a company that Brian had never even heard of. It didn't make sense. Who could possibly be backing someone like James Turner? And why was it such a huge amount of money? The silence in the room was almost palpable now. Brian could feel the weight of the eyes on him. Some of the younger executives were starting to look more interested, while the others still seemed skeptical, if not outright bored. He glanced at his watch. He had other meetings to attend, bigger issues to deal with, and this was just another distraction. A part of him wanted to dismiss James outright, but there was a small flicker of doubt creeping in. It wasn't the first time someone had come in with a flashy idea and some paper-thin promise, but the amount of money involved in this one was too big to ignore entirely. "You expect me to buy into this?" Brian finally said, breaking the silence. "You don't look like the kind of guy who's made a multi-billion-dollar deal happen. And this backing of yours, what's the catch? Who's the real player behind this?" He didn't bother to hide the skepticism in his voice. James didn't react the way Brian had expected. There was no defensiveness, no over-explanation. Instead, James simply stood there, his expression calm and collected, almost as if he were waiting for Brian to catch up to the reality he hadn't yet grasped. "I think you'll be surprised," James said, his voice steady. "You don't recognize the name behind the funding, but you will soon." Brian's eyes flickered to the document again, scanning the finer details, but his mind was already made up. He was the CEO. He had the power. And he wasn't going to let some young developer think he could pull the wool over his eyes. The room was waiting for Brian's response. He could feel the tension growing, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't entirely in his control. "Let me make this clear, Mr. Turner," Brian said, finally leaning forward, his tone sharper. "I've been in this game too long to be fooled by flashy presentations. I don't see a future in whatever this is, and you're wasting my time." The words landed like a slap, the final dismissal that would mark the end of James's pitch, at least, in Brian's mind. But James just nodded slowly, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of his lips. "Okay, Brian," James said, with quiet finality. "But in a few months, you'll be wishing you'd taken me seriously." Brian watched as James turned and walked toward the door, leaving the executives behind him in stunned silence. It had been 2 weeks since James Turner's pitch, and the whole thing had quickly slipped from Brian's mind. The usual chaos of corporate strategy, market shifts, and high-profile meetings had taken over. The dismissive meeting was just another blip in the whirlwind of his daily life. That was until the phone rang early one morning. "Brian, we need you in the conference room." "Now," said the voice on the other end of the line. It was Amy, his chief operating officer. Her voice sounded different. Tense. Urgent. "What's going on?" Brian asked, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. He'd barely had time for breakfast. "It's James Turner. That $2.5 deal, it's real. And it's big," Amy replied. "You need to see this. You're not going to believe it." Brian's heart skipped a beat. He set the phone down, a strange knot forming in his stomach. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd underestimated the young developer. But dismissing him had been the right move, hadn't it? This was a crazy coincidence, right? He'd heard of big moves that sounded too good to be true, deals that vanished into thin air once the dust settled. Still, something about Amy's tone made him feel like he needed to take a look. Brian walked into the conference room, where a few of the senior staff were already gathered around the large screen. Amy stood at the head of the table, pointing to a series of breaking news headlines flashing across the screen. They were all about Turner's project, and more specifically, about the massive deal he had secured. Turner's company, 8-Volt Technologies, just announced a strategic partnership with Hensley Innovations. They've launched a multi-billion-dollar power grid project that's set to reshape the entire energy sector. It's worth $2.5 billion, Brian. This is happening. Right now, Amy said, her voice almost in disbelief. Brian stared at the headlines, a sinking feeling settling deep in his chest. It wasn't just some small-time venture anymore. Hensley Innovations, one of the largest and most well-respected names in the energy industry, was backing James Turner. They were all in. Brian knew Hensley's reputation. Their projects were always game-changers, and if they were behind this, it could very well be the most significant energy move in years. Amy clicked to the next screen. A video of James Turner appeared, speaking at a press conference about the project. His confidence was palpable, his words impactful. He didn't look like the same man Brian had seen 2 weeks ago. This was a different James, a man who was now at the center of one of the biggest energy deals of the decade. "You said this was a pipe dream," Amy remarked, glancing at Brian. Brian swallowed hard. He had been wrong. Dead wrong. "Get me Turner," he said, his voice low. "Now. I need to talk to him." It took less than an hour for James Turner to answer the call. His voice was calm, even a little amused, but there was no mistaking the edge of satisfaction underneath. "Brian," James said, as if they were old friends, "I knew you'd come around." Brian's grip on the phone tightened. He was used to controlling the room, used to being the one people came to for answers. But now, James Turner, of all people, was the one in control. I was wrong, Brian admitted, his voice still carrying a hint of reluctance. I didn't take you seriously. You were right, and now, well, you've got a $2.5 billion deal on your hands. Hensley Innovations, really? How did you pull that off? James chuckled softly on the other end of the line. It's simple, Brian. When you've got the right people backing you, doors open. And sometimes, the right people are the ones you don't expect. Brian was silent for a moment. He had to admit, there was something captivating about James's quiet confidence. He'd never seen anyone so unapologetically self-assured, especially after being dismissed in front of a room full of executives. What's next for you? Brian asked, trying to regain some semblance of control in the conversation. What's your plan now that you've got this partnership? My plan? James repeated, his voice cool. My plan is to change the energy landscape. We're not just building a new grid, Brian, we're designing the future. The technology we're working with is decades ahead of anything anyone else is doing. It's going to change everything. Brian let out a slow breath, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the magnitude of the situation. James wasn't just a developer anymore, he was a player. A huge player. Listen, Brian said, the words coming out slower than he expected. I want to talk about how we can work together. You've got something I didn't see before. I can help you. No, James interrupted. You had your chance, Brian. This deal doesn't need your help. It doesn't need anyone's help. But it could have. That's the difference. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Brian could almost hear the weight of James's words sinking in. You've got your $2.5 billion, Brian said, trying to salvage something from the conversation. But the real question is, where do we go from here? You need people with the resources, the connections to push this further. We can make this work together. I don't need you, Brian, James replied firmly. I've got all I need. The line went dead. Brian stood there for a few moments, staring at his phone as if he could will James to call back, to ask for help, to admit that Brian had something, anything, that could make this deal even bigger. But there was nothing. James was already moving ahead without him, leaving Brian and his empire of corporate control in the dust. And it hit him then, the realization that he had just made a grave mistake. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, press releases, and growing media attention. James Turner's name was everywhere. His company, 8-Volt Technologies, was the talk of the town, and the $2.5 billion deal with Hensley Innovations was taking shape faster than Brian had anticipated. Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something big. He'd seen this kind of success before, but never from someone like James. The developer had been dismissed as a small-time player, but now he was shaping up to be the face of a multi-billion-dollar revolution in the energy sector. Brian couldn't afford to let this slip further out of his grasp. He called another emergency meeting, this time with his inner circle. As they gathered around the conference table, Brian's mind raced. It wasn't just pride that was at stake, it was the future of his company, and his legacy as CEO. If he didn't do something soon, he could very well be watching James become the next big name in the industry, while Brian's influence withered. Amy, Brian began, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling underneath, I need you to set up a meeting with James Turner. Whatever it takes. I want to discuss a partnership. We need to be a part of this deal. Amy raised an eyebrow. You mean after the way you dismissed him in front of everyone 2 weeks ago? Brian shifted uncomfortably. Yes, after that. He's already secured the backing of Hensley Innovations. We can't just stand by and watch him take over the market. We need to get involved, and we need to do it now. Amy didn't respond right away, but Brian could see the wheels turning in her head. She knew as well as he did that James was a force to be reckoned with now. This wasn't the time for pride or ego. If Brian was going to save his position, and possibly the future of his company, he had to make things right with James. The meeting was set for the next day. The moment James walked into the room, Brian could feel the difference in the air. James wasn't the same man he had been 2 weeks ago. There was an air of quiet confidence surrounding him, a sense that he was no longer the one trying to prove himself. He was already proving it to everyone else. Brian stood up, extending his hand. "James, thank you for coming." James didn't immediately shake his hand. Instead, he took a moment, his eyes scanning the room before he finally gave Brian a nod. "What can I do for you, Brian?" Brian cleared his throat. "Look, I know I was wrong about you. And I'm not here to make excuses. I want to talk about a partnership. We've got resources, networks, and a global reach. With your vision and our influence, we could push this project to even greater heights." James's gaze didn't waver. He was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. Then, finally, he spoke. "I didn't come here to form partnerships with people who don't believe in me from the start, Brian. But I'll tell you this, you're not the only one who can see the potential here." There was a pause, and for a brief second, Brian thought James might take the offer. But instead, James continued. "You had your chance. You were the one who scoffed at the idea. Now, I'm building this empire without you." James's voice was calm but cutting, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Brian's face reddened. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. But James was no longer a rookie developer. He was a major player in the industry, and Brian had to face that reality. James stood up, giving Brian a nod before turning to leave. "I've got bigger things to focus on now. Good luck with your partnership." As James walked out of the room, Brian sat there in stunned silence. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him with full force. He had underestimated James Turner, and now it seemed that the future of the company, and the entire energy sector, was slipping through his fingers. The worst part? He knew he would never get this chance again. The next few weeks were a blur for Brian. The media buzz around James Turner and 8-volt technologies intensified with every passing day. James's project was starting to take shape in ways that were impossible to ignore. Major companies were already lining up to partner with him. Brian couldn't help but watch from the sidelines as Turner's empire expanded, while his own company began to feel more like an afterthought. The worst part? Hensley Innovations had announced that they were officially moving forward with James's project. It wasn't just a partnership anymore, it was a full-fledged revolution in the energy sector, and it was happening without him. Brian couldn't afford to sit back and let this happen. He tried to play it safe, dismissing James as just another hopeful, but now he was paying the price. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, he was losing relevance. And it wasn't just his ego that was bruised, it was his career, his company, and everything he had worked for. One night, after a long day of failed negotiations and an increasing sense of frustration, Brian found himself in his office, staring at the glowing screens in front of him. News articles, projections, financial reports, everything was about 8-volt and the rising star that was James Turner. Brian's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was an email from Amy. "We need to talk. It's urgent." He rubbed his eyes, already exhausted. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. For the first time in his career, he was worried about the future. An hour later, Amy was sitting across from him, her expression grim. "Brian, it's getting worse. We just got word from one of our investors. They're pulling out. They're backing James Turner instead." Brian's chest tightened. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His hands clenched into fists as he fought to keep his composure. This wasn't just a lost opportunity. This was the beginning of a domino effect that could destroy everything he had built. "How much?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "10 million. At least," Amy replied. "And it won't stop there. I'm hearing rumors that other big players are doing the same. Hensley's pulling everyone in. No one wants to be left behind. Brian's stomach churned. This wasn't just a financial setback. This was a direct assault on his authority and his vision. He'd made the wrong call, he'd underestimated James Turner, and now the tech world was watching as Turner became the new face of the future. I need a way to get back in, Brian said, almost to himself. I can't lose this. I won't. Amy looked at him, her gaze hardening. Brian, I don't think you understand. This isn't something you can fix by just throwing money at it. James has already built a momentum that no one can stop. The deal is done. It's over. But Brian refused to accept that. The walls were closing in, but he wasn't going to let his empire crumble without a fight. He'd played by the rules for too long, and he wasn't about to watch some upstart developer swoop in and take what he thought was rightfully his. Brian stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back as he began pacing the room. The ideas began to swirl in his mind, faster and faster. He needed leverage. He needed a way to turn the tables. Get me James Turner, he said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. Amy's eyes widened. Are you serious? After everything, I'm serious, Brian cut in, his voice cold. I'm done playing nice. We're going to make a deal, whether he likes it or not. Brian wasted no time in setting up the meeting with James Turner. This time, he wasn't going to beg for a partnership. This wasn't about being humble or trying to regain some form of respect. This was about survival. His company was on the brink, and if he didn't act fast, he'd be left in the dust. The meeting was set for a sleek, upscale hotel suite overlooking the city. Brian arrived first, pacing the room as he waited. His mind raced, coming up with a dozen different ways to approach James. The one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't afford to be deferential. James had outsmarted him once already, this time, Brian needed to be the one calling the shots. The door opened, and James walked in, his usual calm demeanor in place. There was no excitement in his eyes, no sense of urgency, just a quiet confidence that made Brian's blood boil. You wanted to talk? James asked, his voice low, almost dismissive, as if he were humoring Brian's request rather than acknowledging the magnitude of the situation. Brian motioned to the seat across from him. Sit down. We need to talk about your future, and mine. James raised an eyebrow but didn't hesitate to take a seat. I'm listening. Brian took a deep breath. You've done well, James. I'll give you that. But you don't have the infrastructure to support this kind of move. You're not equipped for the scale of what you're building. You're playing in the big leagues now, and I'm offering you access to resources, teams, and global connections you simply can't build on your own. James looked at him for a long moment before leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed. So, what are you offering exactly? More money? More of the same old promises? Brian smiled tightly. No. I'm offering you what you need, control. You can run the project, keep your vision, but I'll bring in the people who can execute it. We'll integrate 8-volt into my company, and together we'll make it unstoppable. The deal becomes a juggernaut. You get everything you've been working for, but with the power to back it up. James didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered toward the window, as if considering something far away. Brian could feel the tension building in the room. He was walking a fine line. One wrong move, and he knew James would shut him down immediately. You're not offering me anything new, Brian, James finally said, his tone calm but firm. You're offering me what I already have, just under different terms. You want to buy in, but you're late. You were late from the start. Brian clenched his jaw. You don't understand, James. This isn't about buying in. This is about survival. You're dealing with something bigger than you, something bigger than Hensley, bigger than 8-volt. You need someone who's been through the battles, who knows how to handle the politics of this industry. You can't do it alone. James tilted his head, considering Brian's words. Then, he shook his head. You're wrong. The world doesn't need another corporate giant running the show. It needs fresh ideas. It needs disruption. It needs something different. Brian's patience was wearing thin. He needed to close this deal, and fast. This is your last chance, James. You're talking about disruption, but disruption needs strength to survive. Without power, without resources, your vision won't make it. I'm offering you that power. James stood up suddenly, his calm demeanor never faltering. I appreciate the offer, Brian. But I've already got what I need. I didn't come here to ask for your help. I came here to remind you of something: you should never bet against the future. Brian stared at James for a long moment, disbelief flooding through him. He couldn't understand how James, this young developer, could be so sure of himself, so confident in his position. The audacity of it all was maddening. But as James turned and walked toward the door, Brian realized that he had lost. There was no deal to be made. James had already moved on. Brian sat back down, the weight of failure crashing down on him. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, the missed opportunity, the arrogance, and the complete underestimation of someone who had proven, beyond all doubt, that he was more than capable of building something far bigger than Brian could ever have imagined. And as James disappeared from the suite, Brian knew there was no way to turn back. The weeks that followed the failed attempt at negotiation were a blur of frustration for Brian. He watched, powerless, as 8-volt technologies continued to rise at a pace that left his company in the dust. Every headline, every update about James Turner's project felt like another slap in the face. His own investors were getting restless, his staff was distracted, and the whispers of his diminishing influence were growing louder. One morning, as Brian sat in his office, he received a call that made his stomach drop. Brian, the voice on the other end was Amy's, but she didn't sound like herself. Her tone was tight, and there was a noticeable tremor of unease. You need to see this. It's about James Turner. Brian's heart skipped a beat. What's happened? It's big, Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Turner's team just finalized a deal with a major government entity. He's got the backing of a $10 billion renewable energy initiative. It's public now, every news outlet is covering it. Hensley Innovations is already making moves to integrate him into their long-term plans. The blood drained from Brian's face. A $10 billion government contract. His grip on the energy sector was slipping. No, it was already gone. James Turner was no longer just a disruptive developer, he was the face of a revolution. How are we going to recover from this? Brian asked, his voice hoarse. Amy's silence on the other end of the line was enough of an answer. There was no recovery. Not without something radical. Something that could put his company back in the conversation, something that would show everyone he wasn't done yet. But even as he thought it, a cold truth settled deep within him: James Turner wasn't just a competitor now. He was a giant, and Brian was nothing more than an ant under his boot. Brian's eyes scanned his office, the walls closing in. This wasn't just about money. It was about power. Control. Influence. He had tried to play it the corporate way, slow, steady, and by the book. But James had played the game differently. He was ruthless. Unapologetic. And now, he was winning. Set up a meeting with Turner, Brian said, his voice dark with resolve. I need one last shot at this. Amy's voice hesitated before replying. Are you sure about this, Brian? After everything? Brian's jaw clenched. Get the meeting. Now. The meeting was arranged for the following week. Brian couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He knew what he was walking into. He was no longer the leader of the pack. He wasn't the one holding all the cards. This time, it would be James making the final call, and Brian had to find a way to turn the tables. The location was set, a high-end private conference room in the city, one where James had held his last few press briefings. Brian arrived early, pacing the room as the minutes ticked by. His palms were slick with sweat, his mind running through every possible scenario. How could he convince James now? The power balance had shifted irreparably. Would James even take the meeting seriously? The door opened, and James walked in, his usual calm confidence in place. He barely acknowledged Brian as he sat across from him, his eyes scanning the room as if it were just another casual meeting. There was no sense of urgency in his movements. No intimidation. Nothing. It was as though he knew, already, that he had won. "I've been thinking," Brian began, his voice controlled but edged with frustration. "You've built something incredible. But you can't keep it all. No one can. No one can do this alone, James." James raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk appearing at the corner of his lips. "Are you suggesting that I need help, Brian?" "I'm saying that the infrastructure you need, the global reach, the resources, you're going to need more than just your vision to make it work. Hensley Innovations can only take you so far. Eventually, you'll need a partner with the strength to scale what you've built." James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Let me get this straight. You're offering me your strength now, after everything that's happened?" Brian's face hardened. "I'm offering you a way forward, James. I'm offering you access to the tools that will secure your future. You can continue to build your empire, but you'll do it faster and smarter with the right backing." For the first time, there was a flicker of something in James' eyes, a brief moment of hesitation. But it passed quickly, and his expression became a mask of indifference once again. "You know, Brian," James said slowly, "I've been thinking too. And I've realized something." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I don't need you. And I never did." Brian's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're making a mistake." "No," James said softly, his voice unshaken. "You made the mistake, Brian. And now it's too late to fix it." James stood up, straightening his jacket and giving Brian a final glance. "The future doesn't wait for anyone, not even you." And just like that, James Turner was gone. Again, leaving Brian behind in the dust. As Brian sat there in stunned silence, it hit him, there was no recovery. No way back. James wasn't just building the future, he had already built it. And Brian had been left in the past, clinging to a world that was moving on without him. The days that followed James's departure from the meeting felt like a slow unraveling. Brian walked through his office, barely registering the conversations around him. His mind was still back in that room, frozen in the moment when James had told him he was irrelevant. The weight of those words was crushing. It wasn't just about a missed opportunity anymore, it was about his legacy, his career, and everything he had built now crumbling before his eyes. The board was getting nervous. Investors were pulling out, and the projects he had once spearheaded were now being handed off to others. Every headline was a reminder of his failure. The stock price continued to drop, and soon, there was talk of potential buyouts. His company, once a powerhouse in the industry, was now just another has-been. And it was all because he hadn't seen the future when it had been right in front of him. One morning, as Brian sat in his office staring at the same headlines about 8-volt technologies, a message pinged on his phone. It was from Amy. "There's something you need to see. It's urgent." Brian felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. He quickly tapped out a reply. "I'm on my way." When he arrived at Amy's office, she was waiting, her face grim. She handed him a folder, and as he opened it, his stomach dropped. Inside were new projections. Numbers he hadn't seen before. They were the kind of numbers that made his heart race. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amy hesitated, then answered, James Turner is moving forward with something even bigger. A new partnership, with the government. And this time, it's not just about energy. It's about global tech infrastructure. The kind of deal that'll put 8-volt in a position to dominate for decades. Brian felt the walls closing in again. It wasn't just an energy revolution anymore. James Turner was positioning himself as the architect of the next digital and infrastructural landscape of the world. Every market was being reshaped, and Brian had missed it. Amy continued, her voice quieter now. He's already negotiating contracts with countries overseas, and they're projected to go live in a few months. The scale is astronomical. Brian slumped in his chair, feeling the crushing weight of what had truly happened. He had dismissed James Turner as a small-time player. Now, he was witnessing firsthand the full force of what it meant to underestimate someone with vision, intelligence, and the drive to make it happen. James wasn't just a threat to Brian's business anymore. He had become a force of nature, one that Brian couldn't stop, no matter how hard he tried. And now, the ripple effects were too far-reaching. Brian was stuck in a sinking ship, watching as it was overtaken by a tidal wave he couldn't escape. The room was silent for a long time. Brian's mind was reeling, but there was nothing he could do. The market was gone. The momentum was gone. And the future was no longer his to control. Finally, Brian stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the city below. He'd spent so many years building his empire, climbing the corporate ladder, fighting for control. But in the end, it wasn't enough. As the sun began to set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the skyline, Brian knew one undeniable truth: the world had changed, and he hadn't kept up. James Turner had built the future. And Brian Hayes was left behind, watching it all unfold from the ashes of his former empire.